Hello cave dwellers and welcome to the cave. For this, a roundup of donations made to the cave in the month of November 2017, a look at upcoming projects and any other business really that I'd like to discuss.
We'll also round off today's video with a Patreon Q&A. My patrons have put some questions to me over the last week, and there's only a few of them, so we'll tag them on to the end of this video. As the winter months draw in, the fire is warming my backside. The stockings are up already, with my kind of gifts poking out of them. Yes, I agree it's far too early, but if Mrs. Mancave will put them up, then I will use them as props. And on we come to our first donation. Matthew contacted me by email and we arranged to meet in the glamorous Fleet Motorway service station to make the drop. And what he gave me included this Commodore 64. We also shared a coffee and Matthew told me about his love of all things Flight Simulator, which I have to say I wholeheartedly agree with. You've likely heard me say before, I think there's something about flight simulators and their place at the forefront of each generation of computer technology that I just love. I really should do an episode on them at some point. Now, typical of most donations, it's been in storage for many years. It does come with the box, which is nice, and it's looking a little bit sorry for itself. But I've certainly seen a lot worse. Now, Matthew can't remember, but he thinks this was an older system board transplanted into a newer case. This is the C64C case, as opposed to the original bread bin style cases. So I thought this would be an ideal opportunity to do several things. We can of course learn about the history of the system and what's inside, as we love to do in our Trash to Treasure videos. We can refurbish it, and we can give it a transformation using something I've purchased. This is not a donation, I purchased this from the Pixel Wizard store. It's a brand new C64 case made to the exact form of the original moulds. A twist on our usual refurbishment method, which of course will avoid retro brighting and, well, give it a finish that's as good as new. Definitely one I'm really looking forward to. It's going to look really smart. It will also give me the opportunity to work with YouTuber Jan Beta, who has an intimate knowledge of the system and works on them on his own channel. He's agreed to help us to identify the origins of the board and to appear in the video. I think it'll be a real treat to have his expertise in the video, and I'm looking forward to making it with him. Matthew also donated an Amiga 500 and a stack of games. Now then, the C64 also came with a stack of games, including some in one of my favourite formats, the clamshell case. In an era of small, transparent and easily broken cassette tape cases, these stood out on the shelves as a cut above. This game is a quality game, they said. This game is premium. Are you really good enough to deserve this game? Can you afford me? Now often they were terrible games, just like any other in the shop. And the reality is, the few pence more it cost to make the case didn't warrant the $9.99 or higher price tag you paid for them. But don't they age well? Better than the cardboard of any big box PC or 16-bit era game. And for me, they still retain some of that class. Just like in last month's donation video, we picked out Rick the Roadie for the Electron, and that was the first game we played when we refurbished it, which with hindsight was a terrible choice of mine. So this month I'm putting the choice in your hands. When we revive this C64, having seen the choice in front of us here, which game would you pick? Which would be the first cassette tape that you would put into this data set and load up if you just received a new C64 on Christmas Day and this choice of games? Let me know in the comments section and I'll pick one out to use in the series.
Oh, and there was this too, the Cheetah Defender light gun, compatible with games like Operation Wolf, Gunslinger and Blazeout, and only with CRT TVs because it was dependent on the CRT beam, so it won't work with modern televisions. We'll try that out, we'll certainly include it in the series, and hopefully it works.
Okay, so next up it's a donation from Nick, who reached out to me on Reddit and donated this Apple Macintosh Performa 400 and Performa Plus display. This is in a non-working condition, The machine came out in 1992 with a 68030 CPU and 4GB of RAM as standard, although we don't know the exact spec of this until we get to work on it. I'll give you a peek inside though, because if we take this on, it's going to be an interesting challenge. And take note of just how easy it is to open this Apple product. 2 clips and you're in. It's almost as if they encouraged you to actually work on it yourself. How times have changed. And look what we have inside, a small forest of through-hole capacitors soldered directly onto the board. This could be fun. The monitor also has a broken power button that won't stay on, but I think that's likely to be the least of my worries. A very interesting system. Thank you, Nick, for the donation, and we'll see what we can do with that soon. The next donation we have is not tangible, it's music. Yes, Aaron contacted me and said, hey, I make music, and I'd like to make you a song to use on the channel. And here's what he came up with. Let's have a listen. That's just awesome, Aaron. I think that really catches the spirit of those 1980s computer shows. Aaron makes a lot of cool synthwave style music, which is on Spotify under the name Son of Helios, and you'll find a link in the description. Finally, we have this very special box, which I can't let you see inside just yet. What we have here is a hamper of carefully selected parts for a series in which, instead of refurbing, we're going to build something new. Something I've had in mind for a while, and I pitched it to modmypi.com, who shared my excitement when they heard my idea and sent everything we need for the internals. So you'll get to see this very soon. In fact, I'm working on part 1 right now. It will also require the use of a workshop with some power tools, which I don't have here in the cave, so we'll be working with and using the facilities of YouTuber Dubious Engineering, who really does live up to his name. And he featured in the national news recently with his homemade autonomous lawnmower. This should be interesting, perhaps a little dangerous.
So those are our donations for the month and a few insights for you in what's coming up. I'm going to put another log on the fire, pour myself a fresh drink, and we'll get stuck into those Patreon questions.
Now then, cave dwellers, and indeed official cave dwellers, welcome to the deepest part of the cave. This is the Patreon chamber. This month it's a Q&A, which I hope will be a regular feature, and there will be other features, which in future will only be for the patrons. And that's for the simple reason that as their contribution to me increases, I need to start giving something back to them. They are an important part of the channel, particularly as YouTube have a habit of demonetizing every single video that I put out there. So to the patrons, thank you. To everyone else, I hope you enjoy this little extra, and if you want to be involved in it in future, then do pop over to my Patreon page and get involved. So let's kick off then with the first question from Corbin Davenport, and he asks, what's your favourite retro PC platform? Amiga, DOS, early Windows, etc., and why? That is a great question, Corbin, and I'm sure if you asked me on different days of the week, it would change. I could also approach it from 2 angles, one from a purely technical, or the other from a nostalgic and misty-eyed angle based on my own experiences, and that's what I'm going to do today. So I'm going to say Amiga, and the reason for that is that when I moved from 8-bit computing with my Amstrad CPC to 16-bit with the Amiga 500, it felt like a quantum leap in a way that I don't think I've felt since, except maybe when I first fired up a PC with a 3DFX card and experienced 3D accelerated graphics. There was something about the Amiga platform designed by Jay Miner and his team that just set it apart. I don't know if it was the custom chips, if it was the dual bus that allowed it to work so efficiently, pushing graphics around and performing CPU computations at the same time, or if it was the pure openness of the platform to the programmers to access parts of the machine in ways that the original engineers never intended and push its abilities year on year. I loved watching that process unfold. I also feel like the Amiga was truly the first multimedia computer, as well as one of the earliest and best examples of a machine for the creators. The amount of content that's created on modern computers is phenomenal, and you only have to look at YouTube as one major example of what people are doing and what they're uploading and sharing. But if you go back to the Amiga days, exactly the same thing was happening. Granted, we didn't have the internet to upload and share it, although we did have BBS boards and SneakerNet, of course, but we were all sampling, creating music with trackers, creating 3D imagery with programs like Imagine, programming from machine code to Amiga Basic to powerful basic programs like Amos, creating fractal 3D flybys of scenery in Vista or Vista Pro, painting and creating animations with Deluxe Paint, or video editing with the amazing Video Toaster package. There was so much to do on the Amiga in terms of content creation, and while that doesn't detract from my love of IBM compatibles and MS-DOS, there was a period when I switched from the Amiga to the PC where in many ways it felt like a step back. Granted, the raw power of the processors and graphics cards and sound cards that were coming out for the PC just brute forced it past what the Amiga was capable of, but in many ways it still felt behind. Windows 3.1.1 and even Windows 95, that was an operating system that was supposed to wow the world. Well, I think for many Amiga users, when Windows 95 came out, they thought, finally, they're starting to catch up. And maybe in the next release, they'll catch up even more with what we were doing in Workbench on the Amiga with a system that was 10, 20 times slower. It was a really interesting time to be in computing, and one that might be harder to fathom if you're only used to IBM compatibles and the standardization of computers, which in itself is a good thing. It's made computing cheaper for businesses and for personal use, and technology has continued to progress, great, but just not in the same exciting ways as it used to be with the Amiga. I don't know, that's just my rambling thoughts on the subject today. Ask me tomorrow, like I said, it will probably change, but the Amiga will always have a special place for me. Thanks again for the question. Let's go on to the next one. Patron Mark Ford asks, what do you do with the trash to treasure items once you've refurbished and repaired them? Do you collect them, use them, or sell them on? It's a good question, Mark, and one that I'm trying to answer myself, actually, because despite the age of my channel, I've only been really creating content for the last 6 months or so. So everything that I've refurbished so far, I still have. Now there's a problem with that. This is called the cave for a reason. I live in a basement flat and space is limited. So much so that my workbench really only has space for one at a push 2 machines at a time. So I have to keep most of them in storage. I do that at the moment using storage boxes, 1 box per system, all labelled up and carefully packed. So I have a Spectrum box, an Electron box, an IBM PC box, and that's fine. It makes it easy to pull it out and film a segment on that machine if that's what I need to do on that day. But it does give me a dilemma, because I don't particularly want to sell them off, and if they're donated to me, then I will never sell them off without the permission of the original donator. In fact, if it came to that, I would always give them first refusal on having the refurbished machine back. It's a different story, of course, if I've bought the machine myself in the first place. Now, I do have an end goal in mind, which is a real pipe dream, but, it may be possible one day. And that's to hire out a space that I can use exclusively for the cave, a studio space if you like. And within that space, I'd love to have all of the systems that I've worked on laid out and ready to use at any point. Not only to ease filming and content creation, but also because they just make great background props as well. Whatever I'm talking about, if you can see the history of refurbishments behind me, software on shelves, retro posters, things like that, it would be a great scene to have, and I think it would improve the quality of the channel. Do I use them? Yes, I do as much as I can, and I do keep promising myself I need to give myself a week at some point where I'm not producing videos and I am just sitting down to play on them. I think a good game review or gaming lore episode is well overdue, so I do need to pull out a machine just for that purpose and to allow myself to spend a bit more time using one of them. I hope that answers your question, Mark, and to you and anyone else who's asked a question, if you want to know more, then do just leave a comment in the Patreon page where you asked the question originally. More questions from Mark then, and the next one he asks is, where did you pick up your electronics diagnostic and repair skills? Self-taught, trained, previous, current career, etc. Well, on the electronics side, it's well and truly in the self-taught camp, and very much taught around the necessity of fixing broken retro equipment. It ties in with my fascination of all things emulation, and one of the first projects I took on was around about 1999, when I found a guy who was local to me where I lived at the time, in Bournemouth on the south coast of England, who had a lockup full of sorry-looking old arcade machines. Bournemouth being a seafront resort used to have arcades, as many of them did around England. And he let me salvage a machine, a fairly generic JAMMA-compatible machine, and I tore the guts out of that machine. I turned it into a MAME arcade, wiring up the original control panel, recapping and fixing up the original arcade monitor to work with the PC, and only electrocuting myself twice along the way. Having tackled that, I looked to take on more projects around retro hardware and just slowly building up my skill with books and often trial and error. I'm by no means an expert, and I want that to be clear on the channel that I am a hobbyist, just like many of the people that watch. The equipment I use is fairly cheap hobbyist equipment, and there's never been a better time than now to research these kind of machines that I work on the channel. Between Amazon and Google, you can probably find everything you need to know to repair that retro machine in front of you. And I make no attempt to hide my sources of information or the hobbyist nature of my electronic skills, because nothing makes me happier than when I see comments on my videos where people say they've been inspired to pull out an old machine from the loft and try some work on it for the first time, or to learn some soldering skills, or somebody said the other day they'd bought My First Electronics kit to start to learn how to do these things. Whoever you are, wherever you be, as Kim Justice would say, there's nothing to stop you from buying a cheap soldering iron, grabbing a piece of old electronics and trying to learn. That's exactly how I did it. The only thing I would say is don't go straight for the retro computers if you're new to it. Maybe start with a broken but fairly recent radio set or something like that, something cheap, and maybe something that won't enrage the community when you show them you've been practicing on an Apple I. Mark, you did have one more question, and I'm going to roll that one over into next month just to answer a couple of the others. So thank you for your questions. I hope I've answered them sufficiently. If not, drop me a message. Patron Niall Donegan asks, what's the current status of the Raspberry Pi Game Gear project? Niall's referring to some videos I made going way back to when I started making content for the channel. This is where I took a broken old Sega Game Gear, put a Raspberry Pi 3 inside it, and connected it up with some of the existing Game Gear components. And it was never meant to be a project in its own right. It wasn't a trash to treasure or a series or anything like that. I just did a couple of interesting things like reusing the soundboard and reusing the power board from the original Sega Game Gear and wiring that up with the Pi. And I thought, that's quite interesting. Other people may like to use those techniques. And then it progressed a bit further. I installed a screen, I filled the case with foam, and we did essentially end up with a finished product, which I showed a glimpse of, but obviously people want to see a lot more of it. And that's where things took a turn for the worse. I thought a nice way to finish that project off would be to get the Game Gear back to a nice matte black, so it looked brand new. And yeah, it went badly. Unless you know what you're doing, don't try and paint a handheld console. What I ended up with was just a horrible, almost tacky-like finish to the paint. It was nasty. And the only way I'm going to fix that is to strip all the paint off or get a new case and start again. Now, like I said, it was never intended to be a project from the start. Otherwise, I would have approached it a bit differently and presented it in the format that evolved to become Trash to Treasure. So I'm sorry that I didn't get to show you that, Niall. I think the Sega Game Gear is certainly something I want to revisit in the way that I have done the Lynx recently. But as a Pi project, I'm not going to be doing that anytime soon, mainly because we've got this other one that's about to start with the Mod My Pi sponsorship. Hopefully that will satisfy your need for a Pi-based project in some way, and like I said, we'll revisit the Game Gear at some point. Probably not the answer you wanted to hear, but that's where we're at with it, Niall. Thanks for your question. Question of the week then goes to Tom Scott, who asks, favourite computer game music? Mine is Xenon 2 Mega Blast, though that wasn't originally composed for the game, so perhaps it doesn't count. Yes, it does, Tom, you can have that one. I just remember being absolutely amazed by it, he says, when I first heard it. For something more synth, Carnival Night Zone from Sonic 3. There's probably a whole lot of much better music I haven't heard. Smiley face. Thank you, Tom, and there are so many answers to this question. I cannot give you one answer. I cannot pick one song for you. But I'll give you a selection and I'll explain why I like these tunes. But before I play my tunes, let's have a quick listen to your choice, Mega Blast from Xenon 2 on the Amiga. Here it is.
Yeah.
I do like your choice, Tom. It's certainly very of the period when we were all being wowed by this new ability for a machine to play sampled sounds within our games. Other examples that wowed me like that were the Blood Money intro from Psygnosis on the Amiga, the Game Over music from Shadow of the Beast 2, and the music in a game called The Power, which includes samples from Snap's song The Power. Here are my choices then, and they span multiple systems and quite a long time period. Let's start with the oldest, which, well, it's not even music, but I wanted to share this with you. There's something about those Williams arcade cabinets, in particular Robotron. When you compared them to other machines of the time, those sound effects really stood out. The bass that they managed to achieve was excellent, and just the pure chaos of what was unfolding in front of you. It was a manic game in itself, but when you added these sounds to it, it just took the whole thing to another level. Let me give you an example. Moving on to the next era, and you can't talk about video game music without talking about the SID chip on the C64 and two of my favourite composers on that system, Rob Hubbard and Chris Hulsbeck. Here's a quick example of work from both of them on the C64 that I really like. The next soundtrack I've chosen is one that I always promised myself if I ever found myself in a situation where I happen to own, I don't know, a Ferrari Testarossa. This is the first and probably the only music that I would play in it while driving around. I'm sure you can easily guess what it is. The more I think about this, the more songs keep popping into my head and I can't keep playing more and more. So Shadow of the Beast on the Amiga gets a definite honorary mention, as does the entire Streets of Rage soundtrack on the Sega Mega Drive. If I were to choose a soundtrack to represent the early multimedia era, then I'd only need to hear a few bars of this to take me right back there. That, of course, was music from the CD version of Return to Zork on the PC. And finally, one more choice for you, and this is my super nostalgic option. It's a song that wove its way over a period of decades through the series Ultima, and it was penned and performed by the real-life inspiration behind the in-game character YOLO. In fact, I'll include a link in the description where you can hear him actually playing it himself. The track Stones featured in several of the Ultimas, but most notably in Ultima Online, at a time when we were dialing into the game using a 56k modem, so you were staring at that title screen and listening to this music quite often while you were connecting up to your preferred server. And every time I hear it, I'm right back there in Britannia, trying to fight my way to the bank amongst all the lag created by other players on dial-up modems, trying to meet my clan, fight off PvP players as soon as I leave the city, and experience the world of a MMORPG for the first time in my life, having been teased by the possibility of that kind of game happening for years before. Anyway, let's cut to the chase. Here's Stones from Ultima Online. Those are all the questions I'll be answering today. I hope you enjoyed the Q&A. To those who aren't patrons, I hope you enjoyed this insight into what we get up to on the Patreon page and what we'll be doing more of in the future, but do rest assured this won't be affecting my normal output with the other videos that we produce. As always, thanks for watching and for listening. I hope to see you again on the channel soon, and take care, Cave Dwellers.